Hello and welcome. I'm Mike Scott, and I'm happy that you're joining us for this third event in our new Zoom series, Cultural Encounters Books That Have Made a Difference. In this series, we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, we welcome Dan Shaw, who will be discussing Milton's Paradise Lost. If any questions occur to you during the talk, would you please type them in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button and not the chat one. Towards the end, I will put these questions to Dan and we'll have a discussion about them. Please don't leave your questions to the very end, because if you do, they get all stacked up and they might not get asked. Daniel Shaw is a professor and chair of the English department at Georgetown University, where he teaches early modern literature, critical theory, and digital humanities. He is author of Cyber Formalism, Histories of Linguistic Forms in the Digital Archive, and that was in 2018, and Milton and the Art of Rhetoric in 2012, and has published articles in the PMLA, Critical Inquiry, Modern Philology, Shakespeare Quarterly, Milton Studies, and Digital Humanities Quarterly. And he's one of a great number over the years of really top-class Milton scholars who have graced Georgetown University. And I'm absolutely delighted that he's with us today. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that kind welcome. I will just note that I can't see anyone except for myself on my screen. I'm going to be doing my very best to be putting out energy over the wires for the entirety of my talk. Michael helpfully suggested that I should regard it like my morning daily affirmations in the mirror, which reminded me that I should start doing morning daily affirmations in the mirror. Let me start by thanking those of you who are here in the audience today and who I get to share my research and my thinking on Paradise Lost with. Thank you to Michael Scott for his kind invitation to share today. Thanks to Mary Gordon with the Office of Global Events and Global Engagement for setting things up and doing the logistics. And I just wanted to say that I'm very glad to participate in the Future of the Humanities project. It's a project that is dear to my heart. Okay. When Michael invited me to give a talk about Paradise Lost for a series on cultural encounters, I admit that I was initially struck by the apparent mismatch of text and topic. There's a sense in which John Milton's Christian epic, which was first published in 1674 in the 12-book edition that we know and read today, that this epic has virtually nothing to say about cultural encounters, since the poem takes as its topics the events in human history, the creation of our first grandparents, their disobedience and fall, events that largely precede cultural difference, the differentiation into cultures, and thus the very possibility of encounters between cultures. The poem, in other words, depicts a unified Edenic pre-cultural culture, which is, of course, itself the imaginative product of Milton's own heteroclite inflection of the 17th century English Protestant culture in which he lived his life. But if Paradise Lost is ill-suited for thinking about cultural encounters, it nevertheless heeds quite well, I think, Pope Francis's call for developing a culture of encounter. It thinks through that problem of encounter quite radically. The rub is that the encounters in the poem are trans-ontological rather than transcultural, which is to say that they take place between beings of different orders of existence rather than between people hailing from different cultures. Most obviously, angels descend from heaven to instruct Adam and Eve. Satan escapes from hell to tempt them. God and the Son converse with Adam and Eve, or at least Adam, before casting them out of the garden. My topic today will be moments in the poem in which the characters in Milton's epic encounter themselves as ontological others, experiencing themselves as suddenly and surprisingly located on a different step on the scale of nature than the one in which they were created. That always means, or almost always means, that characters discover themselves to have descended the scale of nature, to have become something less, more imperfect and finite than what they once had been. In a poem about the fall, the experience of ontological mobility is almost always a bad experience. In various ways that it will be the task of this talk to unfold, Paradise Lost is invested in asking two rather grim questions. How bad can experience be? And what is the worst experience that can be lived through? And my argument today, in response to those questions, is threefold. First, Paradise Lost is concerned not only with the objects and sensations given in experience, but also with what structures, governs, limits, and makes experience possible. That is, it is engaged in thinking about what the philosopher Immanuel Kant, more than a century later, will call the conditions of possible experience. The more simple, sensuous, and passionate medium of Milton's poetry performs its inquiry into these conditions, most manifestly, I argue, through the motif inherited from Seneca and Shakespeare of worse and worst. Second, while Milton's fallen characters ask, how bad can it possibly get? What they discover, to their horror, is that it can always get worse. The experience of suffering is illimitable, without final lower bound. Third and finally, while Kant would later locate the conditions of possible experience in the subject, in the nature of the cognizing I, the I of the I think, Milton sought them as well in language, in the body, in the state, and preeminently in God and God's power. Perversely enough, the illimitability of worst in Milton's epic poem is the consequence of a just universe governed by an all-powerful God, a universe in which God's creatures can always choose sin and thereby merit the punishments, the worst punishments that follow upon sin without limit. Okay, let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen now so you can read along with some of the passages that I will be close reading for you today to illustrate my point. Much of our time will be spent with Satan, who's unsurprisingly the character in the poem who is most dedicated to exploring worse and worst. Paradise Lost initiates its inquiry into the worst with the demonic council in Book 2. Moloch proposes that the fallen angels, recently defeated and cast down to hell, should seek to avenge themselves, reasoning that even the failure of an attack on heaven would be desirable, since it might provoke God to reduce to nothing the attackers. Championing suicide, he asks rhetorically, what can be worse than to dwell here, driven out from bliss, condemned in this abhorred deep to utter woe? Even if his plot does not lead to our destruction, Moloch concedes, since angelic substance may be indeed divine and cannot cease to be, nevertheless, we are at worst on this side nothing. This final nothing has two operative meanings. First, that there is nothing worse than the demon's current punishment. Second, that the only thing worse is to be nothing, to not exist at all, which would, Moloch judges, in accord with the wisdom of Silenus, paradoxically be happier far. Moloch's proposal for self-annihilation, that the demons having arrived at worst, such that by provoking God they can, Moloch's proposal is for self-annihilation, such that by provoking God they can do themselves no further harm. It is this claim that Belial, the most sophisticated and sophistical of the demons, confronts at greatest length after first dispensing with the issues of revenge and suicide. He begins by ventriloquizing Moloch's rhetorical question. Say they who counsel war, we are decreed, reserved, and destined for eternal woe. Whatever doing, what can we suffer more? What can we suffer worst? This question's final worse, itself a phonetic exfoliation of the previous line's woe, becomes the germ of Belial's inquiry. He first asks incredulously about the evidence of present experience. Is this then worst, thus sitting, thus consulting, thus in arms? The demons are at present better off, he observes, than when they were struck with heaven's afflicting thunder, or when they lay chained on the burning lake, since that sure was worse. He points not only to actual experience, past or present, but also to possible future experience, a parade of horribles, including grim fires, racking whirlwinds, and other Tartarian punishments drawn from the literature of antiquity. An 11-line sentence elaborating these prospective tortures ends with a curt 4-word assertion. This would be worse. Though Belial readily admits that the demons now suffer chains and torments, past, present, and possible future experience leads him to advise, better these than worse. He concludes his variations on the theme of worse and worst, as well as his speech, by asserting, our present lot appears for ill, for happy though but ill, for ill not worst, if we procure not to ourselves more woe, folding worst back into woe once more. Belial's proposal that the demons accept their present lot may be no better than Moloch's plan for suicidal revenge, but his reasoning about the worst is surely superior. Belial does not explicitly state, as Satan later will in the poem, the conclusion that there can be no final worst, yet he shows that even to suppose that the demons are at worst entails the possibility of thinking what would be worse, with the necessary conclusion that their present state is not worst. More woe can always be procured. In making the leap from Moloch's at worst to Belial's not worst, Milton was echoing and finally rejecting a range of consolatory accounts of that experience that he would have encountered in the tragedies of Seneca and Shakespeare. Cursed to wander the land of the living, grasping for food that is repeatedly snatched away, the ghost of Tantalus in Thyestes wonders, has something worse, and the Latin word is peus, has something worse been devised than thirst parched amidst water, worse than hunger that gapes forever. On witnessing the frenzy of his wife in Medea, Jason laments, how often God finds us remedies worse than the dangers. Racked by unendurable passions, Clytemnestra and Agamemnon asks rhetorically, if one's fortune is desperate, here the Latin is ultima, which is a kind of extremity or lower bound, why fear fortune's uncertainties? Across multiple tragedies, Seneca's characters point to what is worse or worst and interpret their own suffering in relation to it. Shakespeare's tragedies take up, develop, and rehearse Seneca's motif. Ross from Macbeth promises that things at worst will cease or else climb upward to what they were before. The Duke in Othello likewise seeks to reconcile Brabantio to Desdemona's marriage by counseling that when remedies are past, the griefs are ended, by seeing the worst which late on hopes depended. Though he does not guarantee that things at worst will improve, he supposes that gazing on the worst is itself a remedy, one that ends grief by ending the hopes on which they depend. The motif of the worst appears in its most developed in King Lear, Shakespeare's magnum opus on suffering. At the start of Act 4, Edgar comes on stage, dressed as Tom of Bedlam, framed for plotting parricide, forced to flee for his life, and disguised as a madman. He initially takes the familiar consolatory line. Yet better thus and known to be contemned than still contemned and flattered. To be worst, the lowest and most dejected thing of fortune, stands still in esperance, lives not in fear. The lamentable change is from the best, the worst returns to laughter. Welcome then, thou unsubstantial air that I embrace. The wretch that thou hast blown unto the worst owes nothing to thy blasts. Edgar believes that he has come unto the worst, which is to be welcomed rather than feared, since the worst returns to laughter, while the best, someone of high station, is due for lamentable change. Like Ross, the Duke, and Seneca's Clytemnestra before him, Edgar puts a coherent shape on experience, and that shape is the rota fortunae, fortune's wheel, which establishes both upper and lower bounds of experience and puts them in a cyclical relationship. Those at the bottom need not live in fear, since they have nothing left to lose and nowhere to go but up. The wheel is at once a figure, a metaphor for contingency and an attempt to configure that contingency by circumscribing possible experience, imposing form and regularity on it. Edgar's attempt to place limits on the worst fails almost immediately. The wheels come off, as it were, when his father, the Duke of Gloucester, is led on stage blind, gory-eyed, seeking death. Hearing his father speak, Edgar reacts in an agonized aside. "O gods, who is it can say, I am at the worst?" As with Belial's refutation of Moloch, he first ventriloquizes his earlier self before considering the counter-evidence of immediate experience. "I am worse than e'er I was." Edgar then turns, as Belial will, from the evidence of present experience to speculate on possible future experience. "And worse I may be yet." Only in concluding this line of thinking does Edgar express a version of the worst that Belial never entertains. The worst is not, so long as we can say, "This is worst." The very ability to utter "this is the worst," whether to others or only to yourself, implies that you are not yet at the worst. What is established here is a lower bound not of bad experience, but of logos, of articulate speech. While death puts an end to suffering and language alike, suffering may reduce us to a state short of death in which language and experience part ways. King Lear represents the sublinguistic zone of suffering, in which it is still possible to perceive and feel and react, but not to render articulate what is felt, through the figure of the non-human animal, as when Lear, carrying Cordelia on stage in his arms, the dead body of Cordelia, howls, "How, how, how, how." Throughout the play, non-human animals stand in special relation to suffering. They figure as preeminent causes of suffering, the boarish fangs and serpent's tooth that can wound. Only humans who have degraded themselves by permitting their bestial passions to overrule their reason are crueler, or, as Lear says of his daughters, sharper. Because of the living susceptibility shared by a dog, a horse, a rat, and man alike, non-human animals also exemplify the fleshly substrate of suffering and vulnerability, cut off from the rationalizing and consolatory capacities of language. In this, King Lear eschews one commonplace of the happy beast tradition that otherwise, as Laurie Shannon has rightly shown, saturates the play. Lear does not depict the descent down the scale of nature as a desirable escape from either the torments of self-awareness or the persistence of those torments past life's end. Instead, subhuman animality is stripped of whatever solace might be gained by the capacity to impose sense on suffering. If only the blunt sense of Edgar's, "This is the worst." Paradise Lost reworks the account of worst played out in Lear to suit Milton's theological universe and the aims of his theodicy. The most articulate theorist of the worst is unsurprisingly Satan. Before his soliloquy at the outset of Book 4, the narrator focalizes Satan's psyche, in which conscience wakes despair that slumbered, wakes the bitter memory of what he was, what is, and what must be worse. Of worse deeds, worse sufferings must ensue. Satan's worse, worse, worse here takes up the motif first announced by Moloch and then developed by Belial. The lines are syntactically difficult because they consist of what linguists call a garden path sentence, one that forces us retrospectively to revise how we parse it as we go. The third repetition of the verb to be, what must be, initially appears as an assertion of existence parallel to the first two, what he was and what is. This first parse asks readers to entertain the impossibility of remembering the future, the bitter memory of what must be. Only after the line break does it become necessary to reinterpret what must be as having a predicative function that joins the subject to worse. Where Belial had considered worse as an avoidable possibility, this would be worse. That could be procured by bad actions, but need not be. Satan, in his despair, mistakenly views it as a necessity that must ensue, an outcome that waits, as it were, around the corner of every line break. He is right, at least, that worse sufferings are the consequence of worse deeds, causal counterparts in the grand scheme of divine justice. No such scheme is at work in the secular universe of Lear, where Cordelia speaks the equivalent non-correlation. We are not the first who with best meaning have incurred the worst. William Empson claimed that John Milton cut out of Christianity the horror torture. And it is true that the poem does not show us Satan crunching on the bodies of the damned, as in the final canto of Dante's Inferno. But rather than being cut out altogether, horror torture is instead translated into an opportunity for speculative inquiry into experience's limits, as in the spatial analysis that Satan performs later in his soliloquy, with worse and worst exchanged for lower and lowest. Me miserable, which way shall I fly, infinite wrath and infinite despair? Which way I fly is hell, myself am hell, and in the lowest deep, a lower deep still threatening to devour me opens wide, to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. The apparent stasis of Satan's perverse stoicism, for which every place is a hell because he carries hell within, swiftly gives way to precipitous downward motion. Satan's fall is not a continuum in which the intensity of pain and woe ratchet up steadily to 11. His abyssal experience is instead a punctuated series of lowest limits that on transgression give way to still lower ones. This downward transcendence produces what Hegel calls a bad infinity, a non-totalizable sequence or endlessly repeated operation, bad indeed, in which each inner hell seems a heaven to the hell that opens up beneath it. Satan cannot stand back and contemplate this ever deeper and devouring deep as a disinterested spectator. Rather, he has a dizzyingly situated experience of grasping experiences lower than lowest illimitability. Thomas de Quincey rebutted critics who regarded in the lowest deep a lower deep as a bald contradiction or instance of Milton nodding, writing that in cases of deep imaginative feeling, no phenomenon is more natural than precisely this never-ending growth of one colossal grandeur chasing and surmounting another, or of abysses that swallowed up abysses. As De Quincey swallowed up registers, Milton's devour transforms this recursive sequence of embedded abysses into infinite gaping maws, marking it as the inverse of the ascending scale in which, as Raphael's dietary account of the cosmos has it, consumption refines base matter into spirit. Satan's abyssal, without bottom or depth, and aporetic without way. His abyssal and aporetic experience of falling propagates among those he has seduced. Adam's lament in Book 10 that he is to Satan only like in both crime and doom is more right than he can know, since he too is driven into an abyss, out of which, he says, I find no way from deep to deeper plunged. Where Lear had posited a zone of animality in which suffering and the consolatory functions of logos part ways, Satan's woe is augmented by steadfast articulacy. In this poem about all our woe, suffering is always and at every moment representable in and through the apophatic capacities of language. Paradise Lost represents the recursive fall into the worse than worst. Suffering is a hyperlinguistic process of tortuous self-awareness and self-disclosure, uninterrupted by even the brute fact of becoming animal. When God punishes Satan for tempting Eve by transforming him into a serpent, in a contrapasso or ironic repetition of his crime, he nevertheless preserves Satan's articulacy. The closing sibilance of Satan's victory speech, which invites the demons to enter now into full bliss, is drawn out against his will into a universal hiss, the sound of public scorn. Even as it becomes the mere voice, the word is phone in Greek, that Aristotle attributed to beasts, this collective utterance remains within the domain of speech, or logos, as a publicly legible sign of judgment. With hiss for hiss returned, the whole host of demons, transformed into serpents, shame cast on themselves from their own mouths. In this, as in all else, God leaves the demons their spirit and strength entire, strongly to suffer and support their pains, preserving their life, language, sense, and consciousness undiminished as requisite elements of their unremitting punishment. Adam coins the poignant term overlive to name the condition of creatures who survive only to suffer, with their life lengthened out to deathless pain. Yet life's end offers no escape. In response to Eve's proposal that they seek death, Adam reasons his way to this conclusion as a postulate of natural rather than revealed religion. Or if thou covet death as utmost end of misery, so thinking to evade the penalty pronounced, doubt not, but God hath wisely armed his vengeful ire, then so to be forestalled. Much more I feel lest death so snatched will not exempt us from the pain we are by doom to pay. Rather, such acts of contumacy will provoke the highest to make death in us live. This passage is so metal. The open exit of Senecan suicide is foreclosed. We pay in life and life in death alike, without exception. Satan's doom, his judgment or condemnation, has similarly reserved him to more wrath. As Milton had put it in his De Doctra Christianae, his Christian doctrine that he wrote, the evil angels have been reserved for punishment. In the theological universe of Paradise Lost, every variety and intensity of suffering can be lived through, and conscious life, as the condition of miserable experience, can survive every sort of misery, including life's end. The downward illimitability of bad experience stands in striking opposition to the upper limit of good experience. God himself ensures a fixed upper limit of good experience because he is that limit. His creations discover their blissful finitude in the origin point of God and their penal infinitude in their distance from that origin. Before driving the rebel angels from heaven, the Son foretells that, in the end, thou shalt be all, and I in thee forever. The faithful angels reside just this side of all in all. One step higher will yield no better experience, since it will, as at the end of time, end them as independent subjects of lived experience as such. God's obedient creatures find their final repose in their eschatological dissolution of self into godhood. Distinct geometries of motion attend the extremities of good and bad experience. Satan encounters the lower limitness of worst, as we have seen, as recursive falling, plunging hellward into an abyssal space that is itself plunging hellward. By contrast, the angels dwelling at the upper bound of good experience participate in a mystical dance that resembles the orbital geometry of the planets, with their mazes intricate, eccentric, intervolved, yet regular than most, when most irregular they seem. Where Satan's precipitous falling afflicts him with vertigo, the problem for the good angels, a problem the poem both identifies and attempts to fend off, is the monotony attending eternal repetition. In heaven, the apparently irregular adorns a more fundamental regularity, and even, as Most When Most suggests, intensifies it. More than 2 decades before publishing his epic, Milton had acknowledged and sought to rule out the problem of monotony in his anti-prelatical tract, The Reason of Church Government. Yet it is not to be conceived that those eternal effluences of sanctity and love in the glorified saints should by this means be confined and cloyed with repetition of that which is prescribed, but that our happiness may orb itself into 1,000 vagancies, which means wanderings, vagancies of glory and delight, with a kind of eccentrical equation, be, as it were, an invariable planet of joy and felicity. Raphael similarly assures Adam that heavenly creatures have also our evening and our morn, we ours for change delectable, not need. This change delectable attempts to leaven a confined and cloying sameness without introducing loss into the beatific existence. For angels, even the seasons and their change are variations on a fixed and invariable cycle. The experience of worst protracts into horrific, recursive, proliferating difference, while the best and highest experience orbits tightly around a still point of ecstatic self-obliteration, adorned with intricate and delectable, but finally an essential difference. Both geometries of motion are compatible within a single space, as when Moloch describes the demons as driven out from bliss, condemned in this abhorred deep to utter woe, with utter serving as an adjective meaning at once outer and extreme, and also as a verb, to give expression to. The demons fall ever outward towards an ever receding extremity, without ever shedding the burden of articulacy. Where the angels and Satans are planets orbiting the center of bliss, Satan is a burning comet, simultaneously driven out to utter darkness and down to bottomless perdition. One instance of downward transcendence in Paradise Lost stands out for the concreteness with which it is represented. Raphael relates how in the war in heaven, when Satan and Michael battle, Michael's sword, deep entering, shared all his right side. Then Satan first knew pain and writhed him to and fro convolved. So sore the gritting sword with discontinuous wound passed through him. This pain is first, not just for Satan, but for all of creation. To know pain here is not merely to become acquainted with a new object or feeling in experience, but rather to gain access to a new quality or kind of experience. It is a punctual change in bad experiences' conditions of possibility. Michael had earlier charged that Satan into nature brought misery, uncreated till the crime of thy rebellion, identifying this change as the consequences of violating the political rebellion and juridical crime order. This first pain is not a necessary concomitant, a wound or discontinuity in angelic bodies more generally. The other angels remain unobnoxious to be pained by wound. It is instead specific to wounds wrought in Satan's newly fallen body. Later in the century, John Locke would disintricate wound and pain using quite a similar scenario, writing that it was not necessary that God should annex the idea of pain to the motion of a piece of steel dividing our flesh. The effects of first pain go beyond mere feeling or sense, causing Satan's body to react in ways like writhed, to and fro convolved, distinctive to the serpent he will later inhabit and then embody. A novitiate in woe, the rebel angel Nisroch concludes that pain is perfect misery. The worst of evils and excessive overturns all patience. There he makes precisely the transcendental error that Belial's, for ill not worst, rejects. While the account of Satan's first pain accords with Locke on the contingency of the link between wound and pain, it diverges from Locke's distinction between primary and secondary properties. Locke writes that the idea of the figure in motion of a sharp piece of steel does not give us the idea of that pain which it is able to cause in us. Unlike the piece of steel's figure and motion, pain is not a property of the steel itself or our idea of it, though it has the power to cause pain in us. Milton's verse, for what it's worth, unmarks this same distinction, perhaps an imitation of the Homeric metalepsis whereby weapons are freighted with pain, rather than merely causing it. If so sore could potentially modify the verb past in this passage as a flat adverb, and could even vaguely be attributed to Satan himself, it most readily attaches to Michael's gritting sword, to which it's most proximate in the sentence. On other questions, the verse is silent. Does Satan's body gain a new organ of sense, of the kind the narrator requests in the invocation of Book 3? There plant eyes, all that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. Does God directly annex pain to Satan's wound? Or is pain, as I suppose, an incipient effect of Satan's general bodily corruption, occasioned by his own voluntary turning away from God, which diminishes his brightness, throws him down the scale of nature, leaves deep scars on his face, and eventually renders him unrecognizable to his fallen peers, his unfallen peers? In any event, Satan gains access to a quality of experience that the obedient angels lack and Milton's readers possess. The poem has us witness him downwardly transcending the limits of the angelic sensorium towards our own susceptibility to suffering. Satan's pain is first, but it is the first of indefinitely many. Surprised by suffering, his comrades in arms swiftly join him in the novelty of bad experience. Cloven to the waist, Moloch feels uncouth pain, uncouth in the sense of unknown, unacquainted, from the Old English kunan, to know. Soon the entire satanic host is first with fear surprised and sense of pain, till that hour not liable to fear or flight or pain. Pain does not arrive alone here. It initiates a parade of new and horrible consequences, spilling over into passion and action alike. Fear, the Greek is phobos, as Aristotle defines it, cannot exist without pain, algos. Since fear is itself a sort of pain and also derives from the imagination of future destructive or painful evil. Like Satan's serpentine writhing, the rebel angel's flight is an embodied reaction to pain and fear rather than a feeling or sense. Pain and fear and flight with more and worse to come. And yet this initial sequence of demonic woes scarcely compares to the range of unsightly sufferings and inhuman pains borne by miserable mankind that Adam witnesses in the guided hilltop vision occupying the final 2 books of Paradise Lost. Adam's survey of biblical and providential history is also, or therefore, a survey of the manifold sufferings that he has brought upon humankind through his original crime, and that his progeny increase and multiply through their own derivative acts of disobedience. For those who, like Satan and his demonic crew, those who persevere in disobedience, pain swiftly becomes a constant and familiar companion. But familiarity is not a consolation that God permits, and the bad surprises never stop. The readings of Paradise Lost that I have shared with you today have sought to recover Milton's imaginative inquiries into experience and its limits. This recovery is not simply a matter of adding a new chapter to a conceptual history such as Martin Jay's Songs of Experience. It also recasts one of the well-worn, best-worn, I would say, narratives of European intellectual history. In that narrative, Kant instituted a new kind of intellectual project by putting metaphysical speculation off limits to rational inquiry, which was instead tasked with reflecting on the subject's own transcendental constitution. In Michel Foucault's influential retelling, Kant's analytic finitude put man in an unstable double role, at once the privileged object of empirical knowledge and the constitutive subject that is the unique foundation of all possible knowledge. Yet Milton's transcendental thinking about experience suggests that Kant's consequential intervention was not, in fact, to initiate inquiry into the limits of possible experience, but rather to confine such inquiry to the nature of the cognizing subject. Kantian critique achieved its rigor and systematic character in part by excluding the role of history, language, bodies, politics, and divinity from constitutive roles in lived experience. Milton's poetry, I've suggested, makes no such exclusions. For Milton, as for a host of 20th century thinkers, the conditions of the possibility of experience are historical, linguistic, affective, material, political, and theological, as well as narrowly subjective. Unlike Kant, Milton understood these conditions to be mutable. When they change, so too do the limits on what can be felt, sensed, known, and lived through. Even as my talk today has claimed Milton as a poet of lived experience, it is suggested that that category is too narrow to comprehend the transcendental thinking of Paradise Lost. The poem represents experiences impossible within limits of our own current sensorium, experiences that are no longer available to fallen beings, try as they might to regain them, demonic experiences that we can only hope will never be our own, experiences of torture that do not end with life's end, limit experiences that would surely obliterate us, and first experiences like the knowledge of pain that are all too recognizably our own. Paradise Lost is a poem of lived experience, yes, but also of yet to be lived, no longer livable, lived through death, unlived and unlivable experience. We need not affirm the pessimism of the poem, as Milton, with his faith in redemption, ultimately did not, to see in it a dire warning. Paradise Lost cautions us time and again that every means of preserving life in its capacities is also a means of reserving life for more and worse suffering. Even as it imagines unbounded downward transcendence without metaphysical solace, it expresses an abiding faith in divine power at the service of divine justice. Those who lack such faith but acknowledge our present lot to be, as Belial suggests, for ill, not worst, will need to make rather than find further limits on new bad experience. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. That's a terrific paper. I'm very grateful to you. If people got any questions, please put them through to us now, and we'll ask them. There's one coming from Carol Gobowicki. Is Adam presented as the stoic wise man by Milton, who has no place for emotions, and therefore as a person striving for an evil that cannot be reached because it must always run parallel to embodied experience?
Thanks for that very thoughtful question. Adam is not the Stoic of the poem. The Stoic of the poem is Satan. It's Satan who brings hell with him wherever he goes. The idea that your external state circumstances can change entirely, but what matters is the state that you bear within you, and your internal disposition. That is the Stoic wise man. That separation is what Stoicism recommends or counsels as a possibility. But it's important to say that Satan is a bad Stoic, right? Most obviously because he takes the inverse lesson, right? He bears hell within him rather than heaven inside. So it's not that he has insulated himself from evil, it's actually he brings evil within. But also, I think Milton makes Satan a Stoic so that he can essentially reject Stoicism, to see the way that we are actually contingent on so many things and ultimately on God, and that our happiness depends on our historical circumstances, on our language, on our history, on the political circumstances in which we live, and then for Milton, ultimately on our obedience to God. Adam is not a Stoic. Part of what Adam first reasons his way to, and then what he is able to gain directly through revelation, through basically having divine truth given to him in conversation, is precisely this fact that we are not independent beings. We are actually contingent on our circumstances, including most directly on God. Thanks for that good question.
Thanks for that. The poem was published in full only 14 years after the Restoration, and at that time when Catholicism was gradually fighting back after a period of intense puritanical rule. A via media of Anglicanism was to ward off eventually the accession of a Catholic monarch after the death of Charles II in 1685. To what extent are the tensions you discuss in Milton related to the political and social encounters of the time? We might remember that the new King James II in 1685 had been more or less exiled to the Netherlands and Scotland by his brother Charles, and now he comes, because of his Catholicism, and now he comes to the throne. We've had the Puritans, we've had that whole period under Cromwell, and a kind of a relief in the country. But what do you think, Daniel?
Yes, thanks so much for situating the poem in its post-Restoration context, which I think is certainly very important. It's worth saying that Milton himself was deeply anti-Catholic. He argues in his last prose tract, which is directly engaged with political questions and religious questions in England, and in 1671, he argues for religious toleration for any kind of Protestantism that is based on scriptural interpretation, on the reading of scripture. He there argues that Catholicism should be extirpated because he thinks that it extirpates all true religion. I mean, he has no tolerance for Catholicism. He's deeply concerned about its re-entry into England, and is willing to make a public argument at a time where, as a regicide, his own life is actually quite at risk if he takes political stances. I do want to say, though, that Paradise Lost, I think, has a different approach to politics, and one that I think is captured in some of the arguments I made today. The term that I like for this is one that comes from Gordon Teskey. He says that the poem does what he calls transcendental engagement. And it means that Paradise Lost is not a polemical tract that is geared towards addressing a kind of political question of the current moment. It's rather a stepping back. It's still a political document, but the way that it engages with politics is by stepping back to ask fundamental questions about who we are, in what does our freedom consist, and how did we lose that freedom? So Milton is still very much worried about the political situation in 1674, about how it is that England could have missed out on the possibilities of the English Revolution, how it is that that revolution could have failed and monarchy could have returned. But he is engaging with it not at the direct political level, but by asking, who are we? How did we become the beings that we are? And very much, why is it that we suffer the forms of unfreedom that we do?
Thanks for that. Monica of Malta says, I'm interested in hearing more about how you might think about the final contrapasso, like transformation into the serpent, as a brief loss of articulation and the ability to wield language. You suggest that the sibilance is proof of not losing language, even in their transformation, but it seems to be a moment of full language loss, even though it is brief, since they return soon after to their normal forms.
Terrific. Thanks for directing us back. I can actually bring up that passage on my slides just are still visible to everyone. Yeah, here we are. Yeah, so I do actually read this. I think Milton is very careful to depict this not as a descent from, in Aristotelian terms, from logos into phone, from language into mere animal voice. And I think actually the reason for this is just that, and Milton could have done that. He could have said they lose all articulacy, or they merely hiss. But I think he says this hiss is actually, it's a linguistic sign, right? It's not just a sound, it's a sound that's paired with a conventional meaning. It's the sound of public scorn. And so you're right that these are not highly articulate snakes. They can say only one thing, all they can do is hiss. But what happens is that all they are able to do is express their shame and their scorn for one another. So he preserves this degree of articulacy, that these animals are speaking in the form of a conventional linguistic sign, so that they can scorn each other. That's an element of their punishment as well, that Milton is very careful to indicate in the way that he's framed the verse.
Thank you. Frank Jositis says, there seems a connection to me with Anselm's proof of the existence of God, as a concept is limited by not being realized. Similarly, of the question of the difference between light that is dreamed and light which is experienced. The bounds of inner and outer are destroyed by imagination. Whether such insight is the same as sight is the question.
Okay. I'm not convinced that I quite understand the question. Milton distinguishes between inner and external sight. Their plant eyes, or he says, so much the rather thou celestial light shine inwards, and the eyes and the mind through all her powers irradiate. Their plant eyes, all mist from thence purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. So Milton very much does hope that he can gain a new capacity for experience and sensation of inner sight, even though he is, by the time he writes the poem, fully blind for some number of years, maybe 15 years by that point, without being able to see. I think that's the example of sight is one that I mentioned in passing as a kind of parallel to or similar instance to Satan gaining a capacity for pain. Milton wants to be able to see internal things that he could not see otherwise. Satan, against his will, of course, is given a new capacity for pain. Whether those two things are parallel is something that I sort of suggest the poem allows us to think, but actually doesn't weigh in on whether these are both expansions of the limits of experience in the same way, that they account for the creation of a new faculty of sense in both cases in the same way. Thank you for that.
Can I just add on a bit more, Daniel, and just wonder whether within Christianity, it's the pain of Christ on the cross, which brings the forgiveness and therefore the redemption. Is that coming through throughout the poem?
So I think there certainly are very many theologies which have pain and Christ's suffering as the center of their Christology. That's true, as I understand it, for Catholicism. Milton is actually fairly unique and heretical in his rejection of suffering as the salvific aspect of redemption. And Paradise Lost doesn't speak about it in that way. Milton has an early poem called The Passion, in which he sets out to depict Christ suffering on the cross and fails to do so. And then, of course, when Milton writes Paradise Regained, you might think that Paradise Regained would be a poem where Christ redeems humanity through his suffering on the cross, through his sacrifice. Milton chooses differently. He doesn't give us Christ on the cross, redeeming humanity through suffering, through pain, through the pain that Satan has introduced into existence, and that becomes an element of Adam and Eve's life. Instead, it's through the resisting of temptation that Christ, the Son, redeems mankind. So Milton's Christology is quite unique, and it seems, well, I would say it's not just an aspect of his theology; it's kind of a trait of his personality that he is unwilling to put Christus patiens, Christ's suffering, at the center of his Christology. Instead, it's Christ, the exemplar. Christ whose behavior we should imitate, and Christ who resists temptation, that gives us a model for how we should save ourselves from sin. There's different theological aspects to that. Some people claim Milton as a Socinian, or as an anti-Trinitarian, or as an Arian, and it's related to some of those differences in how Milton sees the redemption that I've mentioned just now.
Thanks. Mike Collins says this: if I understand things correctly, the encounter of Satan and Eve is a cultural encounter, an encounter between innocence and experience. Does that encounter offer any larger insight into the nature of cultural encounter?
Good question. I would say there's some hard thinking to do, and maybe no obvious answers about what does or does not count as a distinct culture. It's a steady feature of science fiction and fantasy and of this poem, I think, that beings that have originated worlds apart can come together and just have a friendly conversation. There's no language learning that has to take place in the poem. Satan is able to speak to Eve and to tempt her because essentially they already share the same language. They have the same cultural reference points in common. And I don't think that the difference between innocence and experience constitutes a cultural difference. Obviously, within one culture, you can have people who are innocent and who are experienced. But also, I think Milton is pretty clear that innocence for Adam and Eve doesn't mean a total lack of experience. They experience quite a few things. They experience everything, essentially, except for transgression. So actually, I think, there's this fiction you can imagine in Star Trek. It's that you have a computer that does the rapid translation with new alien languages that you've never encountered before. But Paradise Lost has to at least indulge in the fiction that when these trans-ontological encounters occur, the characters nonetheless share a culture, share a language, such that they can communicate fully, that persuasion can take place fully, that they can share information, but what they have is a shared cultural basis on which information can be shared.
Although he's Christian, in this poem, is he covertly asking questions about what does happen after death? Is that something that's...
So wait, I want to make sure I understand. Milton is certainly asking questions about what happens after death. I guess I don't see how is that in contradiction to his Christianity? If you don't mind.
Well, maybe it comes in with Shakespeare's Hamlet, because you quoted Lear, and you quoted Macbeth, and you quoted Seneca, and incidentally, Molly Clark is going to do one of these on Seneca, one of these talks on Seneca in February, which I think will be really interesting as well. But you didn't actually quote Hamlet, and you didn't, and the concern within Hamlet of being and not being, the difference between actually being. And you do talk about of nothingness, but of not being, his fear that there is another world that is forbidding. Is that there within Milton, that there's a fear of this other world, or of nothing?
Okay, so just in terms of doctrine, first to say that Milton is heretical on the question of what happens to you after death. He's a materialist and immortalist. He thinks that on death, your body dies and your soul dies with it, because he's a monist materialist. He doesn't think there's actually a distinction between your body and soul. So you actually are dead until the resurrection in Milton's account. That's just sort of a theological answer to that question. Beyond that, Milton is, I think, very, in the same way that he has a strong urge to kind of avoid depicting the crucifixion and to putting the crucifixion at the center of redemption and of human history. He's actually quite resistant to, after his youthful Latin poem, I think Ad Manso, we never get a depiction of human beings in heaven. Now, Raphael says before the fall, he says, to Adam and Eve, just keep eating and tending to the garden, and eventually your body will sublimate, and you'll become more spiritus and pure. You will ascend ethereally as we, is his quotation, that they will become essentially angelic beings living in heaven. So there's that model for how humans might move into heaven, but that's not an afterlife. That's just an extension of their unfallen, non-mortal existence. But we never see a human existing in heaven after death in Milton's adult works, adult poetry. I think again, I think I included let me bring it up again. Here we are. The passage from Adam Adam reasons his way to the fact that human beings can be preserved after death. There's no escaping God. You can't, and this is what I meant by saying that Seneca's the open door of suicide, which is the Stoic belief that there are times when your best option really is just to end your life, to avoid suffering, to avoid doing anything that's dishonorable. And Adam says no, that mistakes the nature of humanity and the nature of God, because it's in God's power to preserve human beings after their death for the sake of his justice, for the sake, in this case, of punishing them for their disobedience. This is, to me, part of the terror that's built into the poem, that we can't escape. You can't commit suicide and have it just go away and be nothing. So Milton does believe in an afterlife, or of that death in us can live, and it's in order to satisfy the demands of God's justice.
Thanks, Dan. That's terrific, and thanks for the talk, and thank you everyone who's been asking questions. I hope I'm going to have to draw it to a close now, but I hope you'll be able to join us for the event on the 13th of November when Dr. Carmody Gray from Durham University will be discussing Rudyard Kipling's Kim. We have an interesting talk in our free speech at the International Crossroads coming up on Wednesday, November the 15th, when we'll be discussing the freedom of the European press. And that will be at 11 a.m. US Eastern Time, 4 p.m. GMT. Can I thank also the people at Georgetown University and the Humanities Initiative for supporting this series, especially the President, Jack DeJoya, Vice President, Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. Thanks to our administrators at Georgetown, Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. My thanks also to Mike Collins, who helps and advises on this series, and for his participation, asking a question today as well. I would also like to thank Blackfriars Hall for their support, especially John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and their UK Administrator, Kingo Rona Gabnai, and to Maggie Scott at Oxford Scott Education Limited, who does a lot of the administration here in the UK. Again, my thanks, Dan, for a terrific talk today. I think people are going to be talking about that for quite a while. You've raised a number of very interesting issues, and I have plenty of other questions I'd have liked to have asked you. But thank you very much. Thank you all for being with us, and goodbye. I'm Mike Scott. You can get in touch with me at Mike Scott Prof on Twitter, but it's not called Twitter now, it's called X. Why is that? I have no idea. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye. Have a good evening.